Called. I'll put that there.
Great. So let's start with the question, if it's so obvious why we want to leave, then why does about half the country think that we really, really want to stay?
Because people look at things from their own point of view, are generally ill-informed, look at a low-resolution picture of a very highly complicated, high-resolution issue.
But then we just talked about how in Parliament most of the politicians are Remainers.
Right, well...
And they, you think, would not be ill-informed?
You would think that, wouldn't you? But they are ill-informed. You've got to look at history. Do you remember a speech, I think it must have been around 1990, Margaret Thatcher?
Mm-hmm.
She said, the President of the Commission, Delors, said that he wants I've actually written this down on a piece of paper because I knew that I was going to have
Go on then.
I was going to have to quote what he said.
This is Margaret Thatcher quoting.
Margaret Thatcher stands up in Parliament complaining about the drive to give the EU more power. She says, President of the Commission, Delors, said at a press conference the other day, he wants the European Parliament to be the democratic body of the community. He wants the Commission to be the executive, and he wants the Council of Ministers to be the Senate. No, 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 she said. And that was the beginning of the end for Margaret Thatcher. She got knifed in the back, basically, by her party, and got replaced by John Major, who was a very pro-EU Prime Minister. Now, there were other issues, obviously, to the demise of Margaret Thatcher, but she basically came to the sudden understanding, hang on, they're going to take the power from Westminster and move it into Europe. And when we joined it was the European Community at the time. When we joined that, there was no European Parliament, there was no European President, and there was certainly no European army.
So wait, Europe, it sounds to me like it's happened in a few stages. Like, because when we first joined, how long ago was that?
Well, it was in the 70s that there was a referendum about joining the single market.
Okay.
Yeah, which was basically the EU was marketed as a trading zone, and it's actually been a political union in through the back door, because we didn't vote to join a political union, we voted to join a trading zone.
And then there was the euro, and that came in much later. So how did that?
That was in the 80s, and they were all saying, if we don't win the euro, it's going to be a disaster. Basically, all the predictions which these people were making have always been wrong. So these experts saying how it'll be a disaster if we leave without a deal and all that, they've always been wrong historically. There's no reason to believe that they're going to be right this time.
Right.
But the point I was going to make is that recently they made some secret documents, not secret because it's a 25-year thing for secrecy on records, and under Edward Heath, he was under the full information. He knew that they were going to try and create a federal Europe. And one of the civil servants released a document which basically said, by the time the British public realise what's going on with this EU thing, it's going to be so complicated to leave that they won't have the stomach to do it. So their strategy was basically to entangle us into this European Union, which wants to become a federal Europe. And a federal Europe will be akin to the USSR. It'll be an oversized state with centralised power, with a group of countries with no shared interest, no shared language, and no shared identity, and it will be completely inefficient. And we've already seen that the EU's failed on virtually every criteria you can choose to imagine. It isn't going to be any better the way that it's going.
So when you say the word federal, I immediately think, well, what about America? I mean, they share a language and maybe some sort of culture.
Yeah, they share an identity.
Yeah.
And even they are risking breaking up. You know, California's interests are vastly different from other states.
But what does federal mean? It means like an overarching kind of, we're in charge of everything, and then there's all these little places.
Have you heard of the New World Order?
Yeah, but I'm not like I haven't done my conspiracy theory research. I've sort of heard a bit about how there's some elites.
The idea of one world government, or one, like uniting, getting rid of the nation state and replacing it with a single unified world.
Right.
It's a really nice idea, but it's very naive.
Right.
Yeah, basically, it's the reason the left likes this is because it's like group identity. Rather than dealing with individual states, put everything in groups. Rather than deal with the individual, make it a group. And you know how group politics and individual politics are completely contradictory to each other very often.
Well, I just think, just at first glance, the idea of there being one whole kind of federation of the planet, of the world, like in Star Trek, or it's never going to work because the cultures are too different across the countries. And, for example, how we're into democracy and we have the individual culture, other people have democracy, but the collective culture. And it's going to clash at some point with the values, isn't it?
Well, also, there's practical implications, Remove all the borders, no one's going to want to stay in the crap countries. They're all going to want to go to the good countries, aren't they?
Yeah.
So it's called behavioural sink, where mice will start to congregate in certain areas where there's best opportunity, and then that will be highly congested and other areas will go empty. And like people would flock to London, people flock to Frankfurt, while other cities in these countries are becoming dilapidated and because everyone's trying to flock to the good place.
Anyway, so we're going off topic. But basically it wants to become like the USSR, and it looks like it's on its way. I hear that there's they're trying to make an army now. When did that happen?
They've denied it for the last 20 years. Well, we're never going to have an EU army, but it's coming to the point that they're getting underway. They're asking for military funding, etc.
From where do they ask for military?
Well, because they're very good at spending other people's money. It's the way the budgets work. The budgets are going up and up and up and up every single year. They're demanding money for this, money for that. And very often it's kind of wasted on projects like, I don't know, a highway through Spain in some area where no one's ever going to use it. Mm-hmm. And it's just... they're always saying, there's always little plaques on things like the EU supplied this as if it's just given it, but obviously it's spent someone else's money on it. And
money's had to come from somewhere.
Correct.
So some countries aren't doing well in the EU. Has there been any other countries wanting to leave?
There's one country which is left.
Which was?
Greenland. But this was at a stage...
Greenland or Iceland, or are they the same place?
Greenland. It's a Principality of Denmark. Denmark is still in the EU.
Right.
But Greenland left.
When did that happen? You didn't hear about that. I didn't hear
No, well, I mean, the EU was in its infancy, really, at the time.
Right.
But they made all the same arguments that they're making now, saying, it's going to be a disaster. Greenland's going to do terribly. And it went on to thrive outside the EU.
Right.
Now, maybe it's not a really good direct comparison because
they weren't so caught up.
Well, yeah, and also I don't know I can't remember the exact details over what their arrangements are concerning like free movement and the European Economic Area, and a few. There's also some, like they're talking about maybe if we leave we can join up in a pact with some of the Nordic countries because they've got a little thing going together.
Right.
Like a free trade zone between themselves, which is outside of the EU, but it's kind of it's trying to get entangled into the EU, and a lot of this is very complicated. But the point of the matter is, the one we joined, it was meant to be a trade thing, and it is actually, we can see if you look at it that it's meant to be a political organisation where you've got power migrating from here to somewhere far away where they don't really care to rule in our interest. Mm-hmm. Now, as much as you can have these thoughts about a one world government, the closer you've got power to home, the more you can keep a check on power, and the more likely it is to be serving the people it's meant to be serving. Mm-hmm. As soon as power migrates abroad, it's not really going to be acting in our interest particularly. And people say, well, you've got two conflicting arguments here, really. They either say it's got no power, they haven't stolen power from Westminster, well, in that case, there'd be no need for a European Parliament or a European President. Or they have got power, in which case they've taken those powers from Westminster. Either way, the situation is ideal. I think we should be ruled by ourselves. It's fundamental principle of sovereignty.
Yeah, I think some people were saying, the Remainers, that, it's all a myth that they have the power and all of this. And also I've seen on Facebook these messages where people are talking about how in the European... I'm going on a blank.
I know what you're going to say. You're going to say we're saying it's undemocratic, and they say, well, it's not undemocratic.
No, yeah, there's that argument, and then there's the argument that some of the things that they're bringing in are really, really, really good, like that they're gonna, stuff to do with animal welfare and or was it something like that? Yeah, I can't remember.
I know, the thing is, they're credited for a lot of stuff that they're not actually really. Right. They shouldn't really be credited for.
What do we know that they're? What kind of things have they? What kind of rules have they made that aren't in England's best interest so far? Can you think of any?
Well, I mean, you do realise it's a tariff zone, blocking and tariffing imports from outside Europe.
So basically, if we import and export within Europe right now...
There's no tariffs.
There's no tariffs. But if we want to get, say, some mangoes from somewhere else, then we get charged for each mango and that goes to the European Union? How does that work?
Yeah, there's basically, they charge an import fees to keeps the competitors outside Europe uncompetitive, because if we buy from them, we've got to pay 8% flat fee on everything, but then certain items and the list is bizarre, things like unicycles, or sugar, have got higher percentage tariffs because it's basically a protectionist zone.
So is this what Rees-Mogg was talking about? And he said one of the first things we could do when we leave the EU is take away all the extra payments that we've been paying on all of our food. But he didn't make it sound like it was from outside the EU. It sounded like it was just all of our food was being taxed and extra. I don't know,
well, there's farming subsidies, and there's money floating about, which is a bit of a gravy train, and people want to protect this money that they're being given within the farming community, which kind of makes sense from their individual perspective. But the money that they're being given is actually our money, which is going out to Europe, and then some of which is coming back.
Right.
So the actual pot that we send. Yeah. I mean, this was one of the arguments that the Remainers were making about the 350.
This is almost like how to bribe people in England who are in industry, because basically, if you're a farmer and you're in England, you get a bit of money from the EU, whereas before the EU, you just didn't see that money. As a country, we're giving all of that money to the EU and some of it's coming back, but actually if we didn't have to give it to the EU in the first place, there should theoretically be more money in England. So why would there be a crash?
Right, there's winners and losers basically in this redistribution of money,
right?
And the people who are winning obviously don't want to give up the fact that they're winning, right. And there's a lot of worry about, so if you're a farmer, you're worried that...
But there must be a minority. In the UK, it's not like agriculture is our main source, is it?
No, but the EU does grants for all kinds of things, so universities and stuff get EU grants. Even the BBC gets a bit of grant from money out the EU, and there's lots of big business which benefits from the EU for a variety of reasons, not just subsidies, but the way that it's organised in their favour.
So what's going to happen to the universities if that money stops coming? Well, fees going to go up again? I mean, what I don't understand is how come years ago, at some point education was kind of free and now it's really expensive. I'm going to get into 60 grand's worth of debt in 3 years. That's really outrageous.
I hate to tell you, you've fallen for a big con, this university thing.
No, let's not go there.
Well, I mean, the amount of money they charge, they basically, it's a business to make money, whereby you have to borrow money which gets paid back in your future.
Yeah.
Now, this can work out to your benefit. And don't get me wrong, I'm in favour of education. But you've got people taking courses which aren't going to get them a job. Like, they're just... Don't
say psychology. But anyway, that's not the point. The point is, what's going to happen to the university? So they used to be funded by the government, and now they've become sort of maybe more business orientated. So now they're really about making money, or do they make money for the government as well? How does it work? I don't even know. Well, I think they operate. To me, UEL looks like a business the way it runs.
Yeah, it seems to be a business model.
Yeah.
And our fees are pretty high in this country, but regardless. Let's think about it logically.
See, how can they be getting subsidy from the EU when people from outside of England, including in the EU, have to pay even more for the university?
Because...
Or is some of what they're paying coming from their country? I don't get that. To try and encourage people in Europe to study.
I mean, theoretically, it's like each country is sending loads of money to the EU, which then earmarks it for different projects. So it might might say that's going to go to science over there, and that's going to go into this project, and that's going to go into infrastructure here, etc., etc. So they're managing this money. Now, the thing is, you had this Brexit bus with 350 million a week to the EU. Well, they discussed that in quite some detail, that 350 million was the net figure, and some people were arguing they shouldn't have used the gross figure, they should have used the net figure. But basically, of that 350 million, say we get 2/3 of it back,
right,
for instance. It doesn't make the figure wrong, but it doesn't mean that you're going to have 350 million more in your pocket, because they were kind of making a pledge that once we leave, they will give the money which comes out of Europe to farming subsidies. They'll supply that out of what we were giving Europe. Or the science people, they're not going to go short. We'll make sure they get some of that money. But we should be left with surplus. And obviously you can't give...
So you're saying that the government are saying, we're still going to give you that money that you would have got from the EU, so don't worry about it.
The government weren't saying anything.
That's weird, isn't it?
This is another issue.
Why don't the government say that?
No, because the government weren't... They weren't impartial. They should have been impartial on the referendum and give you the pros and cons of each side. Instead, they fell behind the Remain, printed a leaflet.
It sort of feels like there was this guy talking on YouTube, and he said, it sounds like the actual parliamentary people themselves, they're all like backhanders, and then what they're going to do is present just get the most terrible deal, maybe no deal, and then totally destroy the economy as best they can, and then in a couple of years' time say, wasn't it great when we were in the EU, let's go back.
Well, we're thinking about this subject's too complicated really to have short answers to. I mean, like, we've just gone completely
it just sounds like that, because when we're talking about, right, so this money's going to the EU and some of it's coming back, but our government hasn't turned around and said, right, well, when we stop giving money to them, that money that we're not sending, we can still send you your portion, you won't be worse off. They could have said that, but they haven't.
Well, let me expand on why that's been, how that's been. Firstly, the government wasn't impartial. They should have been impartial and said the pros and cons of leaving and remaining, and some sort of... they should have had some kind of forecast about what would happen if we stayed, what would happen if we leave, with some firm ideas. They didn't. The people who were advocating leaving were making suggestions, but they had no political authority to deliver any promise. So any promise made in the name of leave wasn't a promise, because you can't promise what you can't deliver. If you're not in power, how can you make a promise that you're going to do such and such? You've got no power to do so. So they were just making suggestions and highlighting ideas. But we didn't vote leave on the basis of anything that they said was going to happen. We voted leave because we want to leave. That's why most people who vote leave, it's very straightforward. We want to leave. We weren't voting on what would happen once we leave.
Right.
But regardless, the government fell behind Remain.
Yeah, that might have played a part in it, though. You could say people had ideas like, well, if we're not part of a democracy, then we want to leave because in the future, it could turn sour and there's nothing we can do to stop it. Stuff like that.
We want to make our own decisions, ultimately, and that's what leaving the EU will allow us to do. We won't be bound by a lot of...
See, now I can't understand why that isn't appealing to the Parliament. Why they don't want that?
Well, think about... Let's just take 3 or 4 examples. Neil Kinnock, anti-EU opposition leader in the 80s. He now works for the EU, gets a really big fat salary, gets a big pension. His family have all got jobs for the EU. They're making a ton of money. He's very pro-EU now, funnily enough. Tony Blair was anti-EU when he was a young politician. As soon as he just before he became Prime Minister, he had a meeting with the Bilderberg Group, who are basically the most influential, richest, most powerful people who have a secret meeting every year, which isn't so secret anymore.
Right.
And when he come back from that, he suddenly switched from being anti-EU to being pro-EU. And now he's a very, very rich man. So there's a lot of people, like, I think, is it Heseltine? There's a few of the lords, certainly on massive fat salaries, which come out of the EU pension pot. There's a lot of people making a lot of money. And this is basically their retirement nest egg. The politicians know once they finish their political career, it doesn't matter what a failure they were in British politics, they've always safe to get a job in Europe and get a load of money for it. They're very well paid, a lot of people in Europe. And they don't even really have to show up much to get their money. So there's that interest.
It's like I kind of like really want a job in Europe now. You've sold it to me. I'm well up for it.
Yeah. The thing is, there's a legal principle is that you must never be a judge in your own case. If you've got a vested interest, you're not in a good position to be judging things.
Yeah.
Now, the interest of Parliament, I know this isn't legal, but they have certain interests which are not in tune with the general population. And the elite people who control media, the very richest people don't have to pay the prices that we have to pay for being in the EU. They only reap the benefit. So the people who reap the benefit and don't pay the cost are obviously going to be pro-EU. And there are winners and losers in the EU. But the way that I believe you should approach the subject is not thinking about your own personal circumstance, but taking an overriding view of the principles involved, looking at the history, looking at where it's going to go. That's something that no Remainer has ever taken on. All the debate that we've had has kind of treated the EU like it's a static organisation which isn't going to change, and things will just stay the same if we stay. But we know that's not the case, because we have treaties. The Lisbon Treaty, if you read what's in that treaty, it tells you what would happen if we stay. All member states of the EU are going to have to accept the euro by a certain date in that treaty. So if we stay in the EU, we're going to have to give up the pound. One of the very fundamental powers that a nation state should have is the control of its own currency. So I believe that's disaster. It also says that all the member states are going to lose their ability to veto. Well, people are saying, like, if we stay a member of Europe, at least we've got some influence. We haven't got a lot of influence in Europe. We always voted out. We're outvoted a lot of the time in Europe. To get 27 member countries to agree on anything is a difficult job. But then they're going to take the veto away, so we're not going to have any influence if we stay. And we're the second biggest contributor to the EU in terms of what we put in. We put in more than we get out. Some of the countries do that, and obviously some countries...
Well, Germany was supposed to be a big player in the EU, but now they're going into a recession.
It's a massive player in the EU, and the fact that there's a euro is very beneficial to Germany, because it's as if it keeps their currency artificially weak, which means that they're very competitive with export, which is why they're a very good manufacturing country. A lot of the stuff in Europe is to the benefit of the Germans. But then I think the German public now are starting to resent the fact that they're carrying a lot of small countries. I mean, let's go right back. Winston Churchill's idea was to bind Germany to France to stop it all kicking off again. Because we've had a few wars in Europe, which obviously nobody wants. But even despite those wars, Europe's always been more competitive than great big imperial powers like China, which are monoliths and they can't change and adapt. The structure of Europe, with lots of little countries where ideas can float about, people have got different ways of doing things in competition, kind of stimulates growth and stimulates progress. But Churchill thought quite rightly, let's stop Germany and France keep going to war, let's bind them together somehow. So he come up with this idea of basically the precursor of the EU. And he always said, we're part of Europe, or we're of Europe, but we're not part of it. He was saying that our role was the leader of the Commonwealth, because we had a Commonwealth empire back then, and that we were the main player for the English-speaking countries of the world, and that we weren't really the same as the rest of those European people. We don't see ourselves as European in our identity, in our outlook. And he didn't really want us to be part of this. And so we weren't when it started. And then later on, we decided, we've got to get involved in that. And at that stage, there were countries which were developed countries on a similar sort of level: Italy, Germany, France, and us. Seems sensible. But they've expanded, and they're taking in these tin pot countries like Bulgaria and Romania, countries which have been ex-Soviet countries. Typically, they've got a lower quality of life than we've got. They've had weaker currencies, etc. And when they've jumped aboard the EU, they've obviously seen benefits. But if you've got a group of people and some of them have got no money to their name, it seems, that the rich people are carrying the poor people. And that seems like very moral and noble. But very often these things end up that everyone just becomes poor. The government is elected to serve us, the people of the country, not to serve people abroad, overseas. That's not their priority. And the way that things are going, it becomes very socialist.
How come the euro has benefited those countries, but then there's countries like Greece that it's not done much good for Greece?
Because
and there's and you think Greece would have been closer to where Germany or France would have been. I mean,
Greece had to cook their books to get in. They didn't meet the criteria to get in economically,
right.
And they had to cook their books. Some very creative accounting went on in order to get them onto the euro. Once they were on the euro, they lost the ability to manage their own money. A country when it's in trouble very often devalues its currency. Well, if you're on a currency which is being shared by everyone, you can't do that mechanism. So the only way out of their economic trouble was to have a policy of austerity. And funnily enough, that was inflicted on them by the EU. They had a democratic vote against it and it was ignored. They had to follow a policy of austerity and pay back money that they owed. And that caused a lot of suffering in Greece. And all the same people who used to protest in this country about the 1% and all these rich bankers, etc., etc., seem to be the same people who support the EU that's inflicted austerity on Greece. It's different. We had a general election and elected a government who were running on policy of austerity. Because, under Labour, the national debt just has gone huge and people want to get this money paid back. Which is kind of, I know national economics is not quite the same as a domestic household, but that's, people view it as such. And if you're running with huge levels of debt and you're paying vast amounts of interest, that can't be good. But like I say, we elected a government who said we're going to cut back on spending and try and get this debt paid back. Greece voted democratically against following a policy like that, but it was inflicted on them by the EU. The EU are a big bunch of bullies, and they're a bit like a mafia organisation. Once you decide you want to get out, they don't want to let you escape, especially not if you're a cow that they can suckle on. And we're they've been suckling on our breast for quite a while.
So let's go straight into the nuts and bolts of why we want to leave then. So we've already talked about, we wouldn't be in control of our own money if we ever had the euro, but we don't at the moment. But that would happen eventually. We wouldn't have control over our policies. Well,
your sons and daughters might well be serving in a EU army, which will be conscripting you regardless of gender. A national service might well be on the cards for people for the EU army. But let's not get into scaremongering and speculation.
What are the main reasons? Why do we want out? Why are we saying we want out? Other than
the EU has failed on every criteria you can imagine. That's why we want out.
Right.
It's taken power away from Westminster. It takes money away from this country and spends it unwisely in many cases. You have the complete disaster of the migration scandal, which has been going on. The mismanagement of borders and Schengen.
So I know that at some point, I think England said or Europe said, it's an open door for any Syrian refugees. But then as soon as they said that and word got round, refugees started coming from everywhere and they don't have a passport. Yeah, we're Syrian even though we don't speak the language and all that sort of stuff.
Right, well, firstly, you've got to look at the definition of refugee. I mean, because what we're getting are not refugees. We're getting economic migrants. That's not the same as refugees.
So is it or is it not true that an economic migrant is coming here to work, therefore they're more likely to get a job, pay taxes? Because a refugee would come here maybe without even the language, I'm just putting it out there, and they would be more of a strain on the...
Well, I mean, it's a very complicated
Yeah.
topic, just to sum up in such a simplified fashion.
Yeah, I know.
But let's. I prefer to dodge that question unless we're going to go really into that. The point of the matter is that Europe said, let's get rid of all internal borders between countries, and then have joint responsibility to police the external borders of Europe. Yeah,
Right.
that was the.
Okay, that's good. Before we go on to the external borders and the migration and all that, the internal borders, what did that mean? Did that just mean if I want to work in France, I don't need to
Don't
get
fill
a
out any
visa?
paperwork. Just
no
go over
paperwork.
there. You're a European citizen.
Yeah, so boom, I get a job, no problem. It's easy peasy.
Sounds really good, doesn't it?
Yeah, it sounds great. And then they can do that here, and we all just can go anywhere in Europe. And before we were part of Europe, we would have to get visas. Each country had their own. Well, I'm wondering as well, what is the Europe? So if we're all in Europe, what is the work visa situation? People outside Europe as well.
Everything comes down to definitions, really, because the EU like to redefine everything in a way that I seem to disagree with. I've always believed free movement is quite a good thing.
Yeah.
And with a British passport pre-EU, you could walk into most countries, wave your pass. You just back the people out the way with your British passport. You could go anywhere in the world and it would be respected. So no problems going away as a tourist. You could go on holiday to France pre-EU.
Tourism is one thing. I mean, we could probably still surely do that in the future.
Free movement is, in my opinion, the ability to move freely.
Right.
But I think that there's a two-way responsibility concerning work. If I want to work in another country, having to apply for a visa seems like a quite legitimate ask. Because as much as I might think that I should have the right to work in other countries, I think other countries should have the right to manage their own populace and their own work situation. And if you've got people coming in from Eastern Europe who are prepared to work on half the rate that your national labour market wants to work for and wants to undercut your workers, I think that the government should be in a position they can manage this if they want to manage it. Now, don't get me wrong, a lot was made of the migration thing with concerns to leaving. I don't think a lot's going to change even if we do leave Europe. But in principle, let's say that it is incorrect that our government is unable to refuse entry to someone holding an EU passport. We don't issue EU passports. Europe issues them. And a lot of the migration which has come in illegally, after a certain amount of settlement in a country for so many years, they'll be eligible for an EU passport. And then we only have a few grounds to refuse anyone with an EU passport entry. One of them is if they're a biohazard, which is quite an extreme example. One of them is if we have evidence that they're actually coming to perform a terrorist act.
And this
we can't, for instance...
This is as it is now.
As it is
with
now.
Us in,
If someone comes to your
We
country
can't
with
really
an EU
refuse-
passport, you know that they're a
in.
mass rapist, that
Right.
they're a member of the mafia,
Right.
and they run prostitutes and drugs,
Then you can
but they've
say
got
no.
nothing on them. You can't say no.
Right.
They've got an EU passport. They're allowed in regardless of criminal history.
Right.
We can't refuse them entry, and this I think is fundamentally wrong.
Yeah.
But we should be allowed to say who comes into our country and who doesn't. As I say, I don't think from a practical perspective it's going to change anything. But how can anyone disagree that a host nation should be allowed to refuse entry to people who are not nationals of that country?
Yeah.
But we've got off because I was trying to set this up.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
They've said we'll dissolve the internal borders, which will make things
so that's
easier to move around.
That's what we've just talked about. It's a bit of a disaster, isn't it? Really. I mean, in terms of like not being able to control.
Yeah, but it's good for big business because each citizen now, rather than just competing with the rest of his countrymen, is competing across the entire continent of Europe with anyone who can work on lower rates, who has less desire to feed and support a family in expensive properties in London, etc., etc. I mean, if you look at the Polish, who are very hard working, and I've got a lot of respect for, there are stories of them sharing the same bed, 20 of them sharing a flat. They do every hour under the sun because they're not trying to make a life here. they're economic tourists. They come here, they work like stink, they undercut everyone, they earn a load of money, and they take it home and they start a business, and good on them, because that's a good strategy from their point of view.
Yeah.
But, if you actually look at what that does, it undercuts.
Well, there's nowhere for English people to go and do the same thing somewhere else. So if you're an English person and you are going to start your business here, then you kind of, then...
Well, it undermines our wages. It undermines... I mean, we worked for years and years to try and get good working conditions, regular breaks, health and safety in the workplace, etc., etc. And a lot of employers are flouting what's gone on before, because people who've come over from poor backgrounds in Eastern Europe will just put up with not getting breaks, etc., etc., because they feel very lucky to have a job, and the English currency that they're sending back to support their families, which again is a very noble thing, it goes a long way. So they're supporting their families back home, but it doesn't really help us. And how much money must be leaving our economy for other nations back home? I don't know. But regardless, the EU let down a lot of countries like Greece and Italy, because when they dissolved the internal borders, they said, what we'll do is we'll take collective responsibility for the external borders. But Greece, in its economic crisis, wasn't really given much aid. They've got all these people landing on the beaches of all their islands, and they have to protest them. The law was, the first place that they land, they should be registered. And Greece couldn't pay to register and process all these refugees landing on. So they just let them go free, let them wander through the up north into Europe. They said, we'll let you go, and just so they've wandered off unregistered. We don't know how many there are, but we see camps like in Calais and stuff. A lot of them have wandered around Europe. I mean, like Sweden's full up with people trying to learn Swedish, and some towns have got more refugees than natives in them. It's been completely mismanaged. The EU didn't fulfil their side of the agreement, because they didn't support Greece. They haven't supported Italy. Spain's got problems with this as well, and quite rightly, countries like Italy, they've got fed up with this.
And what does the European Union have to say for themselves on these issues? Like, they're not held accountable, then no one can really stand up to them. Who the hell are they?
Well, the answer,
because
for
they're
the
not
EU,
anywhere, are they? They're just this
the answer
sort
for
of
the EU
hypothetical
is, firstly,
body.
just call everyone a refugee, even if they're not a refugee. And if they were genuine refugees, you'd expect to see more women and children amongst them. But they all seem to be men of fighting age who are, for some reason, they're trying to start a better life for themselves, because they think that this is the land of milk and honey. And maybe, compared to their countries, it is. But I'm sure that their countries need men of a certain age to build and actually regenerate themselves. I mean, you've got countries like Lithuania, where they've sent a lot of workers over here. I don't think it's benefited Lithuania to lose half of its workforce.
Right.
Maybe on an individual level people have benefited, but it's probably not good for them either.
Right.
Anyway, what are the EU doing? Their solution is to just make all migration legal. Rather than have... You got a problem with illegal immigration? Well, just make it legal. Then you haven't got a problem with illegal immigration. This is what there's been a thing signed recently in Morocco, Marrakesh Agreement.
Oh yeah, what was that? Isn't that something that I remember you saying about it, and something to do with the Prime Minister also signed it anyway, so or something. So even if we leave the EU, we're still
I think we're signed up to certain treaties. I don't know how we're going to... I don't know the exact situation, whether we can get out of these things legally or etc, etc. But it seems like none of it really got any good media coverage. It's not...
Right.
And I don't think that's a coincidence that these things haven't been covered in the media. No one wants to really explain what's going on. Everyone's kept stupid.
So what is it, the Marrakesh Agreement?
There's a few different things. People are calling it the... UN Pact for Migration Pact, but the couple of little nuggets which are worth knowing about are that it's going to make any criticism of migration is going to become illegal. So you got the free speech angle here, which is an important angle, because free speech is a fundamental right that you should be able to delve into a subject and say things which is going to upset people, because if they're important issues, someone's going to get upset about them. But they're going to make criticism of migration illegal, and they're basically going to make illegal immigration legal. That's their solution.
And that's if you stay in the Europe. So everyone who says, oh, people who voted out, they're just racist, they just don't want immigration. I mean, I think it's fair to say that people just don't want that much immigration.
Well, you know what? When a pendulum swings to the left,
right,
as it has done, sooner or later it's going to swing back to the right. Any system, like if you say, I want no borders, that's lunacy. If you say you want absolute borders, that's lunacy. You need to be somewhere in the middle, managed borders. And Italy's a great example, because Italians, they're fun-loving, nice people. They've had all this migration, and it's pushed them politically further and further right. Because the governments weren't doing anything in the interests of the people. People are feeling neglected. Why aren't we being listened to? We've got these huge problems, and you're just inviting more and more people. They at the end of the tether, and what happens is an extreme reaction. And I mean, we haven't really got any problems, and I don't see any likelihood of the far right getting over here. But some of the people who have been called far right by the media, it beggars belief. The EDL, English Defence League, with Tommy Robinson. Now, he's been slandered left, right, and centre. But if you looked at the EDL, they weren't a racist organisation. They had a Jewish wing, they had a Hindu wing. And Tommy Robinson's never said anything racist in his life. He's always said multiculturalism's a triumph. Yeah, he's grown up with Sikhs and Hindus and Jews, and everyone's got along fine. He only has a problem with Islam. He hasn't got a problem with multiculturalism. He's got a particular problem with one culture. And the EDL was a response about Islamification of Britain. And they had some valid points. And because a few people outside of them turned up and wanted to be racist, etc., it can't tar the entire organisation as a racist organisation. I mean, I'm sure that amongst Labour Party supporters, one or two of them are communists. It doesn't make the Labour Party a communist party, even though they might have some sympathies and some crossover.
They probably do have that somewhere.
Yeah, and just because, say you're a famous person, you're a singer, Lady Gaga, I'm sure one or two people who like Lady Gaga music might have far right beliefs. But you can't suddenly say, oh, Lady Gaga, she's the doll of the alt-right.
So basically there's more of a right-wing thing happening. Is it right-wing or is it just right? It's not left anymore.
It's right, but when you've got something can be right without being extreme right, without being Nazi, and it's, people try to slander Farage as a racist, and people try to say that UKIP's a racist party, etc., etc. Well, you might have elements. It's quite possible, but it doesn't make you racist just to believe that you should have borders around your country. Right. And I mean, look at the way the media.
Do you know how many people are coming at the moment?
They always give you a net figure, something like, I'm picking this figure out of mid-air, but it's got to be approximately somewhere in the right region of 300,000 a year or something. Right. But when they say that, that's actually the difference between people leaving and people coming. So just because you've got 300,000 more people a year doesn't mean that's what's coming. You could have, for instance,
500,000 but 200 going, but it's probably not that many.
Well, I think it could be something like you've got 600,000 leaving and you've got 900,000 coming. Right. So net migration is 300,000, but you're losing 600,000 wealthy people who are going off to retire in Spain, and you're getting 900,000 poorly educated people who are undermining your unskilled job market. Now, you see, but I mean, they always paint the picture that all these migrants are going to be rocket scientists and, they're highly skilled professionals who are going to work in the health service, etc., etc. But then you've also got that's not the case. You've got a lot of people come in who are doing basic jobs and competing with our natives who, if they can't get a job which will pay enough money to support them, are just going to sit on the dole. And the actual economics of this migration is very complicated, and you can take multiple arguments some say, oh, they're a net benefit, and others say they're a net loss.
And then it's really what happens is they're children that grow up and get educated and then should be educated and able to properly do that. But then I saw this programme about Sweden and how, because they've obviously got huge migration issues, and that it's not the new migrants that are the problem because they're really well looked after. It's the children of the migrants that are all not doing well because all that wonderful funding and stuff, it stops, or if they've come from sort of poverty and they're not really integrating because they're all going into not ghettos, but they're going to congregate with each other because all people that come from different cultures want to live with each other because that's more comfortable. Just like why is Birmingham got more immigrants than say Norwich or Brighton? Because certain areas, once there's a group, okay, we're going to go there because we've got more people who understand us, and but then the whole city sort of.
I mean, we could do a discussion on any individual facet of this, right, and fill an hour or two on each individual facet of migration. Right. I don't really like the topic particularly because I think it's an emotive topic.
So the thing is that before we joined the EU, isn't it so that in England we were having huge migration here anyway? Like that's
no, it's not the case. That's the case that the left tried to make. But if you actually look at the numbers, it was quite manageable. We had a trickle of people who were coming in, then they were generally integrating into society, and they weren't forming those ghettos. But I mean, you've got the economics of it, which I would actually argue that this idea that migration's a real net benefit is very let's say it's a very selective way of looking at things. If you pan it out, it isn't a huge benefit. I'd say that there's just as many negatives as positives economically. But socially, what you say is quite right. I mean, when you have a terrorist attack and it's someone who was born here, they say, oh, well, see, they were born here. But you've got a generation growing up who don't really know where they are. They're not rooted in this country. If you're living in a situation, you're brought up in a family, in a ghetto.
Yeah. Or they were from Barking, weren't they? From up the road.
I mean, if you're brought up, you're sent to a school where there aren't actually any English pupils, really, because you're in a ghetto. Neither of your parents speak the native language and are not au fait with English culture. And we have got a culture, even though everyone chooses to pretend that we haven't got a culture.
What is it? Fish and chips?
Well, that's the problem you do tend to get from the left. We've got rule of law, individual sovereignty.
No, I think we've got a very strong, a very positive culture, actually. And I didn't know what it was before, but I think I know what it is now. I think our culture is that the English person is generally, like you say, it's individualistic and it's about freedom of speech, and it's based on the idea of individualism and logic and reason and education and responsibility and those things, and tolerance as well, and generally English people are very charitable and that sort of thing. And I just think that's it. That's the British culture. But
there's been a big change recently, though. It's not just because of migration, although that's changed some areas unrecognisably. But you've got also, I mean, if you go back 30, 40 years, when we had 4 TV stations, everyone had a shared foundation of cultural reference. Yeah. People would all watch the same shows. Like now we've fractured. But like I was saying before, these children, they grow up in a family where no one speaks English. They don't really hang about they're not integrating with society because they're not mixing with anyone. Right. They're being sent to faith schools, for instance, and like being segregated. It's not good for society to be segregated along religious lines or cultural lines like that. And I when you've got a small number coming in constantly, you can deal with it, and the people become part of the nation. But when it gets to a certain number, it just doesn't work, and it is unprecedented historic levels of migration we've got. We've got the same numbers coming in months that we used to come over decades. I mean, I could, if you want to explore the subject, you listen to Douglas Murray. Yeah. Douglas Murray will tell you about the Huguenots, and he'll put that in perspective, that the entire Huguenot migration
Huguenot, what's that?
Well, we had a period where the Huguenots came over from France, which was a very significant period of migration. But if you look at the numbers, we get those sort of numbers. What came in 10 years, we get in months. It's at a different level. But it looks really good. Economically, the more people you've got in your country, the bigger your GDP. It looks like everything's really doing well because the economy's growing, because you're flooding it.
Well,
but everyone's got less.
House prices are really quite crazy, and no one can really afford to buy a house anymore.
Well, that's false economy.
And renting is really just unbelievable in London.
Yeah.
And Brighton, and probably a few other places.
But this is a false appearance of things being good when they're not being good. I mean, if you double the population, but everyone's got slightly less than they had, everyone's got less, but the net figure is much bigger, so it looks like you're doing really well. And if you flood an area with so many people that the demand for house prices goes up through the roof, then it looks like everything's booming. But in actual fact, people have just got less because all their money's going on their house. They can't live properly. It's just it looks good on paper, but the actual practicalities of it are not as good as it makes it. But then you've got, other elements I was saying about where the EU is favourable to big business is the red tape and the regulation stops the small person from breaking through. These big businesses, they like the fact that they need a legal department and everything's so complicated that the small company can't compete with them. You have economy of scale.
That's why we've heard that entrepreneurs really are going for this leave. They want to leave, but there must be a reason for.
Well, there's going to be a lot of money made.
Yeah.
If we leave, smart people will always figure a way to make money out of the situation. And the people who are complaining who have got vested interest in Europe, if they've got capital and money and stuff, if they want to make money out of it and they're clever, they'll find a way to make money out of it. But the fact is, once we get out, we're going to be able to import a lot of things cheaper than we can import them at the moment. I remember as a kid, whenever you go in the supermarket, New Zealand lamb would be everywhere. But because of the tariffs and stuff, I'm sure they're not as competitive as they used to be. Australia have got these super farms, which are massive, great things, which use economy of scale to produce food very, very cheaply. A lot of this is going to trickle through. There's going to be some competition, and people are going to get hurt. But we'll be. Have you ever wondered why does our shoes cost so much more than everyone else? A pair of Nike shoes, which are made in a sweatshop in the. I don't know,
£100 or something.
Some
really expensive.
Exotic sweatshop somewhere with children sewing these trainers up.
Yeah.
Yet you buy these in America, they're dirt cheap. Over here, they're a fortune. It's a lot of things will go down in price when we leave. Even if the pound falls in value a little bit, which kind of counteracts it, it's not going to. The prices aren't going to look so different.
What about house prices? Do you think anything will happen to the house prices?
Well, you see, the thing is, no one knows the future. We don't know what policy decisions will be made on migration.
Right.
If we leave, we're not sending all the nurses home.
So the only thing that happens to you think that would affect house prices would be migration. It's literally they're that high because of demand.
Well, you've got supply and demand issues, obviously. Yeah. That's like the major price mechanism is supply versus demand. Right. And if you've got low supply and high demand, things are going to be expensive. But what I'm saying is, a lot of Remainers, a lot of the media put forward this idea, if we leave, we're going to send all the nurses home, we won't be able to get labour from Europe. But we don't know what will happen. If we leave, we'll be able to make the decision whether we take that labour or we don't take that labour. We don't have to make a decision which is completely against our own benefit. I mean, what possible logic would there be to sending all the European nurses home? It doesn't make sense. There's no motivation to do it. There's no appetite for that to happen. So there's a lot of false arguments over migration, which is why I don't really think it's such a great topic to make your basis of your analysis of the Brexit debate on. It's just, what's more interesting is actually what's happened since we decided we're going to leave.
Right.
Obviously, Europe's got a political objective, which is to protect itself, and it makes sense for them to offer us such a bad deal and back us into a corner that we don't go through with it, because they don't want us to leave. They want our money, and they certainly don't want anyone to see that we've done well by leaving and have the thing fall to pieces, because at the moment it's a big gravy train. and they've got their ladles in gravy.
And if everyone else gets, they've done all right, now look at them thriving, trading with other people in the world, let's leave as well, then there is no European Union, so they don't obviously...
No, so that's not an interest they want.
Yeah.
So they've been very, very, what would you say, they've been less than helpful in offering us any agreement. You've got, it's all been hyped up that, if we leave without, we'll crash out without a deal, they say, and... World Trade Organisation would be a disaster, and everyone's so scared of it. The Guardian actually run an article which said that it wasn't as bad as people were making out, and that's Guardian.
And they've got
nothing good to say about leaving.
Yeah, they do say a lot of really, really negative stuff about leaving. I think they're like scaremongering, to be honest.
Well, yeah, they've. Yeah, I mean, when you've people like Owen Jones or these left-wing media people, I don't know. James O'Brien, some of this, I can't ever recall them ever making any valid or perceptive points. There were some arguments actually for Remain, which I thought were quite compelling arguments during the referendum debate. Now, the referendum debate didn't sway my judgment at all, because I've been looking at the issue since I really become passionate about it in 2004 when Tony Blair put migration through the roof, and I started to look at this Maastricht social chapter and all these different things, and I started looking at it then, and I've become quite anti-EU at that time. So my mind was made up 20 years ago. I wasn't swayed by the referendum debate, but the real good point they could have made was about the risk to the breakup of the UK, that Scotland wants something different from the UK, and
because Scotland wanted to remain, right? It was Scotland and London, wasn't it? That were the Remainers.
I don't think Wales were far behind.
No, I don't.
But I mean, you got well.
So why was Scotland? So because London, you can sort of understand.
Well, you can see it because there's hardly any English people in London. Obviously, it's going to have a different priority, and also because. The English people who are in London are the elite who make all the money out of, cheap labour and having their house cleaned cheap, and who don't have to live in a ghetto,
Yeah.
Well, the Scottish, they don't like us much, do they?
No, right.
It's funny. That, it's funny that they voted to stay with us. In there, but a lot of them still want to leave us.
Right.
Yet they want to vote to be in the EU. Why? I don't know.
Maybe they just hate English people,
maybe. I mean, there's always been a rivalry between us and Scotland,
but Europeans are okay, because they're not English, so they're probably all right.
I don't know. It's just not very well thought through. But I mean, you could have made much of the fact that there's a threat to the UK staying together, and that would have been a good argument to make, and I think a valid argument to make. But we took a national vote. We didn't take a vote, based on county. I mean, the idea of Sadiq Khan, let's make London independent from the rest of the country, and that can stay in the EU. Such silly arguments are being put about. I mean, I don't know if that actually came out of Sadiq Khan's mouth. It wouldn't surprise me. But you hear these things in newspapers and stuff, and I don't get my information from newspapers.
Right. Where do you get your information from?
Well, the best way to get your information is through many sources as you possibly can, but also try and go to the horse's mouth.
Right.
Yeah? I mean, when we first voted to leave, people are talking about Article 50. It seemed perfectly logical thing for me to go online and look. What is Article 50?
What is it?
Can I have a look at it?
Yeah.
Well, the article is about the mechanism of leaving the EU, and it's a piece of paper 1 page long. Doesn't take much reading.
Right.
Yeah, everyone's discussing it. I haven't actually read the thing. Let me tell you, I read it, and nowhere in that Article 50 does it mention that we have to pay any money to Europe.
So why has all of this come out? Because I just can't believe that they're so corrupt, so blatantly corrupt, that they would mislead us like that. The politicians.
Well, no, I mean it's a political game. And the thing is, they don't know the strength of their hand. The way if Margaret Thatcher was in charge,
it would be different. I think
she would have thought, "Hang on, we've got the whip hand here.
Yeah.
we can tell them to go and do one.
Yeah.
And then they're going to panic so much that they give us a good deal because they need our money.
Yeah.
And even so, if they don't, if we follow through, it's going to hurt them far more than it hurts us.
Yeah.
So let's play our hands strongly because we've got a lot of power in our hand. They've gone kind of the opposite way. They've thought, oh, let's appease the EU, give them everything they want, and hopefully they'll be nice to us. And so they've offered to give them all this money, which they don't have to give them, and morally shouldn't have to give them. I mean, did we ask Europe for a load of money back after we fought Second World War? And we only finished paying back the debt that we generated in the Second World War, I think 2006 or something, our final payment. We expended so many soldiers, so many lives, so much money to rescue France from the Germans. Did we ever ask for any money back? I don't think that we did. But the idea that if we leave, we should pay all this money, maybe we should take responsibility and pay the pensions of our European ministers. Maybe we could do that. Maybe we should. Maybe we should bear some responsibility financially. But the idea of giving a massive lump sum of money to Europe in order to leave, when you quit the golf club, do you carry on paying premium to the golf club and pay for their retirements? You don't. You walk away and you no longer have to pay anything because you're no longer part of it. And if we jump ship and get out of Europe, I don't think we should be bailing out bank crises and other things like that.
So there's loads of information in all of that, and I'm sure that the last time we talked about this, it was like more bullet point. So do you think you could summarise all the reasons why we want out in like a list fashion bullets? Like, why do we want out?
Well, I mean, principle is number one. The principle of the thing.
Right.
Yeah? The way they've tried to get us into it has been like deceitful.
Right.
The way we've been misled about what it is.
Yeah.
The idea of power being centralised away from us. I mean, this is a move towards a federal Europe. Do you want to be in a federal Europe? If the answer to that is no, you don't want to be in the EU because it wants to push us that way. And when we are in a federal Europe, there won't be any Britain, there won't be any United Kingdom. We will be dissolved into the rest of it. And anything good that we've got will be diluted into a massive superstate. I don't think it's going to be good for anyone. There's that. There's, the principle of borders and their mismanagement of borders and what's going to happen in the future with regards to that.
Have they said anything about what their plans are with, It's weird, I don't even know who the EU people are. All I can think of is the German Prime Minister or whatever.
Well,
but she's not... She's just really in bed with the EU, isn't she? But
Merkel, yeah. I mean, she admitted that multiculturalism was a disaster and then doubled down and just imported more. And they've got a real problem in Germany, I think, with this now. Public opinion is starting to turn against what they've been doing. The thing is, you can't close the stable door once the horse is bolted.
Right.
And a lot of the things that they've done are going to have long-term impacts after these ministers have retired, etc., etc.
Yeah.
And that's actually kind of what's wrong with the political system, that they can make ideas which are beneficial to their 4 years term without thinking about the long-term implications 20 years down the line. But reasons to get out of the EU. It's basically because the EU is not something that you could ever make a case for thinking is a good thing.
Right.
And no one makes the case that the EU is a good thing. When they list benefits, very often the benefits are actually not to do with the EU. I mean, we had...
what name one?
Well, for instance, they're talking about workers' rights in this country as if they were all derived from the EU. I think that we instigated them into the EU. I think we probably wrote most of the legislation on this. And I think we possibly go above and beyond what's asked of us by EU. And I can't see that there's any way that that's going to change with or without the EU. We don't need the EU to have a tea break.
Yeah.
Didn't this come out of the Industrial Revolution that we actually realised that people were being exploited and then set legislation to make sure that didn't happen? Weren't we one of the first countries which had workers get an annual holiday, paid holiday? to credit the EU with such a thing just seems like dishonesty. They say, oh, without the EU, there would be the Third World War. I'm sure that was one of the headlines, or people saying such a thing before the referendum. Well, don't you think that the United Nations has got anything to do with that? What's the UN Security Council? What about NATO? There's lots of bodies involved. Is it the EU? Really? I'm not sure that it is. I can't see there being an outbreak of war just because we're not in the EU. Trade. If it makes sense to trade with each other, people are going to want to trade with each other. If we leave on WTO rules, in the WTO rules, you can unilaterally set tariffs at 0 if you want to.
So if there's companies that have been free trading with Europe and we leave, Europe could put a big tariff on our trading with them, and that could, is this what they're talking about with the, what do they call it, where it's to do with the timing of goods basically, because they're anticipating this is going to happen, they're going to try and screw us, and then any goods that we're waiting
just
for,
in time deliveries, I think.
Yeah, that's
about.
it.
Yeah, well, I mean, there might be some chaos with that, but let's look at this. Yeah, there might be some short-term chaos, but is a bit of short-term chaos worth it for a long-term benefit?
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
They'll obviously have to come to some arrangement.
So basically, if the EU has to think, they really have to think, look, we could sting them and try and screw them over in the hope that in a couple of years' time they'll come back to us. But the thing is, then their countries will suffer because they're not being, their stuff, you know.
I mean, the German car workers aren't going to be pleased if there's a barrier put in the way of them selling Mercedes to London. Like people, you see them all over the place. How many Mercs do you see in London? It's an enormous amount of money there, and there's an enormous amount of will for them to sell their cars here. I don't see why we'd put a barrier in the way of that. I don't see why they would want to put a barrier in the way of that. It doesn't make sense. But regardless, maybe if barriers are put up, there's going to be some extra paperwork. For instance, if they did put tariffs on goods, which we manufacturing, Japan. Japan manages to sell cars all over the world, and they're not in the EU. But if Nissan's got a factory and they want to manufacture cars for export, it's possible to do paperwork so that when they import the parts, they're registered and logged, and then as it's exported, it's it offsets it, and so there's no duty paid because it's not something which is for our market. It goes back out. It's possible to, might be a little bit of extra paperwork. Maybe that's not that efficient. But the EU regulation isn't efficient. Every element of our economy is regulated by regulations in line with Europe, whether it's got anything to do with Europe or not. I mean, everyone was talking about chlorinated chickens. This was one of the headlines. Right. Well, in America, they wash the bird, once it's been plucked, they wash it in a chlorinated mixture, and they wash it off with water. This chlorinated mixture, it's like you taking a jump in a swimming pool. There's a bit of chlorine in it, but when it's washed off, it's not contaminated for good. It's not a big health scare, but this is against EU regulations for a very good reason, because they don't want to have to deal with competing with American imported chickens. Anyway, for instance, we can't have chlorinated chicken because of the EU regulations. Now, is it any business of Europe if we want to have chlorinated chicken? I don't think it's really their business. And I don't think that everything we do needs to be regulated by them. If they've got a regulation that they don't accept chlorinated chicken, fair enough, we won't export them chlorinated chicken because they don't like it. They've got something against it. Well, that's up to them. And if they think that certain electrical devices need to have a certain fuse in them, and that's their regulation, well, it seems only right that we work in line with their regulation when we're exporting them goods. But for stuff made for our own internal market, if I want to put a different wattage of fuse in my... It's not their business, is it?
No.
Why should I be regulated by what they say? And that's what's going on at the moment. We've got, I don't know if it's 10% of our dealings are with Europe, but all of our economy is having to jump through these.
So it might just be easier when we're out, or maybe those regulations. I don't know. I've always thought they must be quite good if they're from the EU, because when you think of EU, you don't think third world country. You know, anything goes. So like I was looking into getting things made in China, and they have the option. You can have it to EU standard if you want, and it's yes, we'll have that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the mechanism was that they're going to write all EU law into British law, so that we're in line with everything before we leave. Seems like a reasonable idea. But then all these laws which are written into English law will be subject to change based on parliamentary procedure.
Yeah.
Which is only right, because if there's a regulation there or there's something...
So why would they make it the same as EU before we leave, just to make things... to make the transition easier?
Yeah, because to rewrite the entire rule book on our own, you see...
Because our rules have been usurped by these other rules.
They have been. Usurped
but
is
not
the word.
All of them.
Well, the highest court in our land is now not our High Court, it's the European court. Yeah. So they're...
And when would a case get why, you know, like we have a sort of a hierarchy in the court system, magistrates.
Well, our High Court actually got, I think it's got an Omega sign outside the front of it, because that's meant to be the end. You know, the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end.
Oh,
yeah?
right.
That's
so
meant to be where the court case
stops there.
Well, it doesn't anymore, because
Right.
if you get a finding there which you don't like, you can now appeal it in the European court,
Right.
which supersedes our own justice. And this is another point of principle which would make you think, I don't want to be in the EU, because I think that our High Court of this land should be the High Court that judges me.
I mean, the thing is, if there's no democracy over there, and it's all right as long as the laws are the laws that you want, but the minute they're not, there's nothing you can do about it. You know, and that's quite scary.
Well, I mean, to say it's not democratic is actually maybe stating a case too far. I think that it's certainly got some shortcomings from the point of view of democracy.
Is it democratic? Can you vote for it?
It's got a thin veneer of democracy, because you can vote for it, but if you find the wrong answer, they'll make you vote again until you find the answer that they want you to find.
Oh, right.
But no, the fact is they've got no reverse gear on their legislation. That's the problem, because it's so hard to get 27 countries to agree to anything.
Right.
But they do it. They manage to get it through somehow. They lobby these things through.
Who from England? You know, who represents England in the European? Do they have a government?
Well, we have European people sit in the European Parliament. We've got a lot of. Well, Farage is famously one of them. He's elected as a European MP.
So he's obviously a Remainer.
No.
What?
He's obviously a Leaver.
Wait a minute.
He ran on the policy of wanting to leave. He said he was a turkey voting for Christmas. Yeah, he doesn't want that fat pension, even though he'll take it while he's doing the job. Yeah, he doesn't.
So, but they haven't sacked him. So what?
But he doesn't want there to be a job for him there, because he doesn't think that we should have people in that parliament, because he doesn't want that parliament having any influence on us.
That's rather heroic. I didn't know that.
Well, it's it depends which way you...
I thought he was unemployed, to be honest. No, I didn't know he did that.
You see, if you talk to the left, you'll get a few different things about Farage. First, he's from the banking fraternity, so he's... I
thought he was a businessman.
Well, no, he was he was a copper dealer.
Right.
I think he used to deal in copper. So he was playing the stock market. He's got married to a German wife. They will say, oh, he's a hypocrite. You know, they'll say, oh, he's taking money out of the EU, he's a hypocrite. Or he's married to a German, he's a hypocrite. Or etc. etc. Or they'll try to make out that he's a bad man because he's one of the bankers, so he's one of the elite himself. But ultimately, he had a strong view about the EU, and he wanted to get it changed. He wanted us out of the EU, and he's made a political career on it in order to try and forward that aim. And I don't actually believe he's self-serving, because I wouldn't have wanted to go through all the things that he's gone through in order, you know, to campaign on it, etc., etc. He's been vilified in the media, he's been slagged off, his life's been made a misery. But he felt strongly about it, and that's what he chose to do. But yeah, we have got representation in the European Parliament, but we can't suggest legislation. It's suggested by unelected people make the suggestions for the legislation, and we vote on it, and we're actually outvoted quite a lot of time, and we're not really fully represented there. You know, if you look at per head of population, Malta's more heavily represented than we are per head of population. I mean, you can look at it a number of different ways.
How does that work? How could that be that Malta would be, you know, it's obviously got a smaller population than England.
Yeah, and it's per head of population, they've got more people representing them. Yeah.
Right.
Because
so they've got like a couple of people, we've got a couple of people, and that means.
Yeah, I mean, it's these things statistically, and I mean, you can misrepresent these things to suit your own
weird,
case.
Isn't it? Because Europe is sort of made up of different bits. Like England, I don't know where we fit into it because I don't visit Europe enough, but it feels as though, you know, the sort of the France, Germany, and maybe Italy is sort of like, well, France and the Germanys are there, and Belgium, but then there's and Spain, and then there's the sort of Greece and Italy, and I guess it's sort of it's cultural, isn't it?
Well,
it feels as though,
you know what? We're not leaving Europe.
Right.
Yeah, we just leave. The EU is not Europe. You know,
Yeah.
we're still.
Because I feel that we do share a lot of things with other countries in Europe, like cultural aspects that all came from maybe, you know, Greece, and all the ideas that are really in our culture.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of them have the rule of law and democratic self-rule and etc. Yeah, a lot of these things, they originated out of Rome and ancient Greece.
Yeah.
Civilization. I'd like to think we can learn something from all different people, but the EU is not Europe. The EU is a self-interested political scheme, and it's not serving the people it's meant to be serving. And I don't see how you can argue much in favour for it unless you're getting something from it. All the arguments that I've heard from Remainers, they either work for a European company, or they've got a holiday home in Spain, or there's always some concern of self-interest. Now, it might be that, well, I'm fairly working class, and I've seen my wages go down. I've seen the rotas change to all Eastern European names over the last 20 years. In casino break room, would you ever hear anyone not talking Russian?
Yeah,
I mean, there's been big changes, but I'm not voting for that reason. I'm not voting because I think I'm going to do well when we leave. I might, you know, if I had to eat beans out of can for the next 3 years because the economy turns sour, etc., I'd be prepared to do it. In actual fact, if I was asked to storm a machine gun nest on this issue, I would do it. I think it's a fundamental principle that we inherited the country with a certain set of powers, and it's our responsibility that we don't give those powers away. We hang on to them so that our children can enjoy those powers. And it doesn't matter what people want to say, oh, you're giving away our children's future. That's not the way I see it. We're actually trying to maintain something for our children, because once it's lost, I mean, the things that we're giving away here were hard fought for. The last time someone tried to take federal Europe was the Nazi Germans, and we had a world war over it. They wanted a federal Europe, and this might be a little bit different in character and how they've gone about achieving it, but ultimately it's still the idea as a federal Europe, and I think we've got to resist it at all costs. Because if you read the Gulag Archipelago, read Solzhenitsyn, a lot of the mistakes that were made in history, it seems, are being made again, and I can only see things ending up in a bad way. I don't even think that Brexit is going to avoid it. It might slow the degradation down a bit, but I don't see the future as very good. I think
so. But at least it's good that the Parliament, you know, have gone against her deal. They've all said, like, we're not into your deal, right? So she had a bad deal. Everyone says that's a really bad deal. Like, so it always amazes me when people don't, like, you know that. It's like when the layman who I'm sitting here really don't know a lot.
Well, her deal is not as bad as staying in an EU with the Lisbon Treaty. Yeah, but we're going to be in an all or nothing situation. The best deal is no deal. From that position, we can do a deal in the future. From that position, our hands aren't tied.
Yeah.
That's the best position to start from, because once we're in that position, then business will do what business wants to do. There'll no longer be any reason that we're going to be punished politically. That's like a blank canvas. What happens in the future, no one can tell, but it gives us a chance. Her deal, it's been mismanaged. Her deal's not a good deal because it's open-ended. We signed up to things which are self-amending that we got. I mean, basically, this backstop thing is basically if they've got a vested interest that if they can't agree with us, it carries on. So they'll just make it impossible to agree with.
And that's how they do business, by the sound of it.
Yeah,
that's
it's like it's a mafia-style organisation. Anyway, my battery on my phone is about to go flat.
Thank you. That was a lot of information.
But I mean, we can talk a bit more another time.